The SEC, is it still the best conference in college football? Taking a little break from your power rankings, do you think that margin still exists over the Big Ten?
I don't think the top of the SEC is any better than the top of the Big Ten. The depth of the SEC, I think, is clearly better than the depth of the Big Ten.
I would agree. I do think that certainly the initial edition of Oklahoma, Texas was more substantial than USC, UCLA, but then you tack on Oregon, Washington, that
Correct.
the Big Ten has closed the gap.
Yeah, like if you made them play off Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and Ole Miss versus Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, and let's say Penn State, I don't think that there's any difference then in one foursome there to the other. I don't.
Agreed, and that's
I think teams 8, 9, and 10 are where we get into the differences, I think.
Yeah, and that's what's going to be important going forward. So for the nerds like us that are measuring 1 through 18 and 1 through 16, we may be able to say, oh yeah, Vandy's better than Purdue, or whoever, South Carolina is better than Illinois, and that's going to be our differential. But for the people that care as College Football Nation, they're only going to care for who's going to compete for a national championship. And I think the Big Ten has met that challenge going forward. We will see it play out on the field. So did anything surprise you about your SEC rankings? Because really nothing stood out to me. I think there are clear tiers or half tiers.
The creative side of my brain went into this anticipating that Tennessee was going to be my surprise kind of playoff team with the young quarterback. That there's and that's where you can find an inefficiency. If you like a Lamar Jackson who started out in a bowl game out of nowhere and ran for a bunch of yards, and so just on a flyer, I bet him at like 40-1 to win the Heisman, and then he does. Okay, now I only bet like $10, so I didn't win that much money. Okay, but I think with Tennessee, what we saw with the young quarterback there against Iowa's defense. There's that kind of potential for them to be a high margin team that everybody's overlooking. I love their defensive front too. One of the best in the country, led by maybe the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. So I went into this anticipating that I was going to have Tennessee be one of my darlings. But when I ran the numbers, there are still some, don't get me wrong, solid top 25 team, but there were still some roster concerns. LSU turned out higher than I anticipated. Because again, just before you get into the nitty gritty, you're like, well, they lost Neighbors, they lost Daniels. Okay. Then you start, but then you look at the numbers. I think it's the best offensive line returning in college football. And if it's not, it's number 2 in my power ratings. I think they've upgraded a defensive coordinator with the change that has been made there. Hard to believe with the way they recruit, they'll just continue to be mediocre plus on defense year after year. LSU, I would have guessed going in that LSU and Tennessee would be flopped. They'd be switched. And what ended up happening when I ran the numbers, I ended up coming away not as high on Tennessee as I anticipated and higher on LSU than I anticipated I would be. I will say, when we talk about Ole Miss, they're a fascinating team to me. I from a playoff perspective, and I'm sure we'll get into this more next week when I release my final preview and projection of the season. Because other than Miami, the other thing I'm going back and forth on is Ole Miss and Notre Dame for my final at-large berth in the college football playoff. And the reason why is they have the same schedule. Now, they're different teams, but they each play like 3 tough games and then nobody else. And the problem with that is I really believe that I think that what has not been discussed enough this offseason, Mark, I know Ward Manuel a little bit. He's my AD. I know how he thinks, okay? And this idea that if you play if in a 12-team playoff, if you play a bunch of scrubs, or you played a 10 soft games and you're Ole Miss, and you only had 2 really tough games at LSU and home against Georgia, and you lose them both, and a 9-3 team that played a lot harder schedule isn't getting in over you. I don't think that's what this committee is going to do, Mark. I think they're going to be much more like a college basketball selection committee. I think quality of wins, strength of schedule is going to matter a lot more. Okay, I don't think there's any stigma about 2 and 3 loss teams like there were in the 4-team playoff, where we never had a 2-loss team ever in the 4-team playoff. I think that's all going to be out the window. And if I were an Ole Miss or Notre Dame fan, these schedules would worry me. In the old college football, I'd love these schedules. I could go like West Virginia 88 and go undefeated, and but we're not playing that game anymore. And I think with the amount of money at stake now and more of an open system, strength of schedule and quality of wins, just imagine your Ward Manual. You're out there every week doing the college football playoff rankings, and Ole Miss has lost its only 2 games that matter, and you're going to justify ranking them ahead of, say, his own team, Michigan. All right, so Michigan's got 3 losses, and Ole Miss only has 2. All right, but who's like Ole Miss's best win? If he doesn't win those 2 games, there's not a lot. There's like no good wins. Like if Ole Miss doesn't win those 2 games against LSU and Georgia, like its best win is Florida, and that's at the end of the year. And who knows if Billy Napier's fired if it's against an interim coach. Same thing gets to be said about Notre Dame. They've got A&M at the beginning, USC on the road, both USC at the end, both on the road. In the middle, they play Florida State at home. Okay, that could be a nice win. But if they lose those 2 bookend games, they play 12 games. They've got 1 win because there's not another. It's not a year where Notre Dame is playing those 3 teams, but then BC's at least, like fringe top 25 kind of, or Michigan State is. Like their schedule, Notre Dame's schedule after those 3 games, Mark, is a wasteland. Like, yeah. Well, I forgot. Forgive me. It's Louisville is good too. Louisville's good too. Okay, so they're in a little bit better shape than Ole Miss. But if Ole Miss doesn't win one of those 2 games, against LSU or Georgia, I mean, there's not a second tier group of wins there. You don't want that kind of a soft schedule. You actually want an opportunity to absorb a loss against an elite team because you're going to beat a couple of also pretty good ones. You see what I'm trying to say? So I've really gone back and forth on what I'm going to do with Ole Miss and with Notre Dame for that last playoff spot.
Yeah, you want to make sure one thing's on your schedule, and that's that you beat at least one good team. You showed that you could beat a good team. And number 2, that your resume is absent of looking embarrassed against anybody, that you were playing the best teams on your schedule and you were playing them tough, even if you lost those games.
Yeah, I mean, another factor here is, let's say both Ole Miss and Notre Dame are both 10-2 at the end of the year. And there's a couple of them, and they're in there for those last spots or 2. Okay. But Ole Miss and Georgia is undefeated. And Ole Miss took Georgia down to the wire or to overtime. That is a better loss than Notre Dame could possibly have win on its schedule. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I think that I've really gone back. And if I had to guess, I'll probably pick Ole Miss because I just think overall their personnel is better than Notre Dame's. But I have switched that in my predictions like 3 times in my preview already. I've really wrestled with what to do with that because you'll see when my ranking, my projection for the college football rankings come out, you're going to see a 3-loss team ranked pretty high because I absolutely believe that strength of schedule is going to matter a lot to this committee, a lot, especially because it's not the selection committee that comes out one time on one Sunday in March and just has to endure 15 minutes with Jim Nantz and and it used to be Billy Packer, but now the new crew, and put up with their questions and go. Ward Manuel's out there every week. Mark, how many Ward Manuel press conferences have you covered? I'll answer for you. 0. He doesn't talk to the press, Mark, unless it's a coaching hire. He's not an AD he doesn't. The idea that he's going to go out there and just is prepared to spin BS. No, Ward Manuel's going to want data. He's going to want evidence. He's going to want his talking points nailed down. He's going to want the least amount of subjectivity as possible before he's put out there in front of those cameras. And so what's he going to do? How's he going to get that? You're going to put a lot based on what teams did on the field and who they decided to play and who they didn't. And I think that's going to be a huge factor in this selection process. And I don't think a lot of people are. So when I keep hearing this analysis, it kind of reminds me of my political job. People analyze politics still like it's 2005 and it's not. Okay. And there's a lot of, what a favorable schedule for Ole Miss. They don't play these guys. It's not, that's not favorable, guys. It's the other way around. Okay. This is not who are the last 2 teams to get into the BCS. This is not, who went undefeated and AP voters just put that team number 1 like BYU 84 when they'd probably be a 2-touchdown underdog to Washington or Oklahoma on a neutral field. Okay. It's not that era anymore. This is going to be much more like basketball, where the strength of your wins and your resume overall, you've already seen some of that in how they've done it in the 4 team. And that's going to, with the 12 team and way more variance now, and more teams to pick, they're going to rely more on that kind of data, I think, than ever before.
So while you are probably right, and I hope you're right, I think people are laying back on this fact that we've run the models, you've run the models, you've taken the previous years, put it in the 12 team. 10-2 gets you there, especially in the Big Ten or the SEC. 9-3 drops you into that maybe 20 or 25% chance of making it. And therefore, 10-2 in the SEC, regardless of what your schedule is, going to have to be seen to be believed by many that that team is going to be left out.
Well, imagine this scenario: 9-3 LSU who beat Ole Miss versus 10-2 Ole Miss. What if it's another team in the SEC? You see what I'm saying?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Because we're not. Some years we'll be sizing those Big Ten and SEC teams up against a second or third team out of the ACC or a second team out of the Big 12. But Mark, most years it's going to be sizing them up against other teams in the SEC and the Big Ten. You see what I'm saying?
Sure. Just look at last year. Louisville, not going to get to the college football playoff. Oklahoma State, not going to get to the college football playoff as second place teams in those leagues. You've breezed by LSU a couple times and addressed them. You know what I find fascinating is the mirror image that LSU and USC are. They lose Heisman Trophy quarterbacks who were supermen on their teams. Now they give way to more traditional pocket passers who are going to be molded by their offenses. They lose. They bring in defensive coordinators who are supposed to fix all the ills. I generally have the same confidence level of each playing in a Power 2 league.
They've both got top 10 coaches in the sport. I would have Brian Kelly a top 5 coach. So in that scenario, I favor LSU because we've seen more of that quarterback in meaningful action, and the fact that he did not go anywhere. I mean, he could have started at 30 other schools the last year if he wanted to. The fact that he stayed tells me they paid him very well, and they paid him very well because they think he is absolutely a big time player. So I'm much more confident in LSU's replacement for Jaden Daniels than I am USC's.